I sentence you to 6 years in prison for gross negligence in the crash of Aeroflot Flight 1492.
Welcome to Planes, Planes, Planes. That recording was of a Russian pilot, Denis Evdokimov, being sentenced by a judge to 6 years in prison for his actions, which resulted in the crash of an Aeroflot Flight 1492 landing in Moscow on the 5th of May 2019. It is highly unusual for any pilot to be sent to prison for causing a plane crash, and this one caused the death of 40 passengers and one cabin crew with 3 serious injuries, including 1 flight crew. I will now set out the crucial errors he made, which cumulatively is said to justify the conviction and sentence. Let's jump right in by giving a brief summary of this flight. Aeroflot Flight 1492 was a Sukhoi Superjet SSJ-100 flying from Moscow Sheremetьеvo Airport to Murmansk, also in Russia. It was 15:30 UTC when the flight with 73 passengers and 5 crew crash-landed. The captain was age 42 with 1,570 hours on this aircraft. The first officer was 36 with 615 hours on this aircraft. At 15:03, the aircraft took off from runway 24 center as normal, and on the climb out, the crew switched to the approach controller. The plane was climbing to the assigned flight level 110 in active thunderstorms when at 15:08 it was struck by lightning. Unusually, the effect of this lightning strike was to disable the plane's fly-by-wire computer system, which is designed to assist the pilots in flying this plane and also limiting some of the crazy things that they might think of doing. This meant that the aircraft was now in direct law. Seconds later, the autopilot disengaged and the plane was hand-flown by the captain. This was something that any skilled pilot should be able to accomplish without much difficulty. So why was the captain blamed and convicted even though the final report has still not been published? He was the pilot in command who bore ultimate responsibility and the one flying the plane. He was, by all accounts, grossly negligent. I will now list the 9 most significant errors in sequence, with the most serious being the last one. I have also timestamped them for those who wish to skip ahead. Before I do so, I'm aware that the YouTube matrix likes subscribers and likes to promote the channel and give it a wider audience. My personal goal is to get to 1,000 subscribers. So if you can, please do feed the hungry YouTube beast called the Matrix. Now let's get on. Number 1. When lightning struck the plane and it went into direct law mode and the autopilot disengaged, he should have delayed commencing the approach whilst they did some troubleshooting, dealt with all checklists and briefed the approach. In essence, the crew and the captain in particular did not stop and think. After all, the plane itself was not in any immediate danger. Number 2. The autothrottle disengaged shortly after the autopilot had disengaged, and it was due to the captain's aggressive inputs on the left side stick. He did not recognize his own error, and the use of the autothrottle would have eased the burden on the crew. This is important because of the crucial mistake he made about speed on the final approach, and which contributed to the crash. Number 3. At 15:15, the controller, having given them vectors, cleared the plane for the ILS Yankee approach for runway 24 left. The first officer, after discussion with the pilot in command, informed ATC that they were not ready for the approach. This was a correct decision as they had not even had an approach briefing. This is evidence of their lack of preparation. The captain then got on the radio and asked ATC for a hold. The controller did not seem to have heard that request, and the captain did not repeat it. Instead, he asked for a circuit, in effect an orbit. He did so at 600 meters, roughly 2,000 feet, but he struggled to maintain the assigned altitude and flew it in an erratic way, which did trigger multiple oral alerts as he could not keep within 200 feet of the selected altitude. This is concerning that a captain is unable to hand fly an aircraft with the required precision. Number 4. In preparing for the approach, the crew armed the speed brakes, which would normally be automatically deployed once the landing gear touched the ground if the aircraft was in fly-by-wire mode. This was a grave error and a lack of preparation. Had they used their checklist properly and handbook, they would have known that in direct law the speed brakes have to be manually extended, as it would not deploy automatically. Number 5. At about 11 nautical miles from the runway threshold, the crew informed the controller that they would be performing an ILS approach for runway 24 left, by which time flaps 2 had been extended and speed reduced to 190 knots. They conducted the landing checklist. Crucially, the crew performed neither the required before landing briefing nor the approach checklist. Number 6. At 1527, the glide slope for the ILS was intercepted and the ground run altitude was not set. Landing clearance was then given. However, at 1528-26, at 1,600 feet, a wind shear warning sounded, accompanied by a voice message. Go around, wind shear ahead. In 11 seconds, there were 5 message warnings of go around, wind shear ahead.
Go around.
So you then ask, how did the crew react? Unbelievably, the answer is no reaction whatsoever. No comment, no action. Aeroflot Handbook makes it clear that in such a situation, they should normally go around unless they are sure that there is no wind shear ahead. They could not have known that there was no hazard, as they did not discuss it. This is a jaw-dropping inaction, and these warnings were in place to ensure the safe operation of the aircraft. Number 7. So the crew continued the approach. Next was the oral alert for 1,000 feet. Aeroflot Operations Manual expects at this stage for the crew to check that the criteria for a stabilized approach was satisfied. The crew did not do so. At 15:29:21, the oral enunciator stated approaching minimums. First officer repeated this. At this point, the descent rate was increased to 1.4, which triggered a glide slope warning. The captain's response to this was to say advisory. The requirements they should have followed in this scenario was to monitor the angle of attack and its advisory only below landing decision height. More importantly, Aeroflot Manual states that when glide slope warnings sound below 1,000 feet and above 100 feet, a go-around should be performed. Exception is that if the crew is sure that the visual weather conditions do not justify it, they can treat it as a warning. Again, there was no communication between the crew. Was the captain really in command, as he was not proactive at all? This is an example of a reaction from an Aero Mexico flight when the glide slope warning was received, recognized, and the pilot stated what corrective action she was taking.
Glide slope.
Correcting?
Glide
Sure.
slope. 200. Glide slope.
Inexplicably, the captain incredibly increased the airspeed, and at 16 feet from touchdown, the landing speed, which should have been 155 knots, was 16 knots higher at 164 knots. Above the runway threshold, he was still below the glide slope. Number 8. At VTAD position, the captain started to close the throttle lever position and initiate the flare by raising the nose. He then amplified the pitch even further by moving the stick backwards and then immediately advancing it forward to its maximum range. I know it's not the same, but imagine driving a car and turning the wheels full right and then immediately full left, and only a racing driver could conceivably recover from such a situation. His actions caused a reverse counterpitch change. Remember that he was in direct law and there was no fly-by-wire system to temper his actions. When I do cover Ural Airlines Flight 178, you will see the difference when the fly-by-wire system stops a pilot from crashing a plane. The first touchdown was at a speed of 158 knots at a pitch angle close to 0. Number 9. Side stick advancing is not allowed after the beginning of the flare to prevent late flare. In order to prevent bouncing, the side stick pitch must be kept in the same position as at touchdown. The captain did not follow the rules and the plane bounced. He had the side stick at a maximum retard position, immediately followed by then moving the side sticks to the maximum advanced position, a complete no-no. After the first bounce, the pilot put the thrust reverser in reverse mode, which should only be done when the wheels are on the ground. So the reverse thrust never deployed. The side stick was in the maximum advanced position, so it was not surprising that on the second touchdown, 2.2 seconds later, at a speed of 155 knots, the front landing gear hit the runway first at no less than 6.85 Gs. After the second bounce, he then put the throttle in toga, but this was ineffective as once the reverse thrust has been engaged, the toga mode will not work. At 140 knots, the aircraft hit the runway for a third time at a vertical G-force of no less than 5 G. As the toga did not work, reverse thrust was then repeatedly engaged and speed reduced to 107 knots. This action did not cause any change as the engine stayed at idle. The engines had been damaged at this point and a cargo fire warning was displayed. Flight attendant reported fire and the APU fire warning came up. The APU button had been pressed during the approach phase. Here is a video of the moment the plane came to a halt and the evacuation. The only bright spot is that no one died on the ground. This, of course, is little comfort to the families of the deceased. Imagine if it had crashed into another plane or a building. Until the final report comes out, we cannot be sure what caused the fire, but what we do know is that the fuel tank was undamaged. The landing rate should have been between -150 to -200. The pilot was required to maintain a precise descent from 600 meters. He simply did not do so, and it was not a stabilized approach. Remember, you can always go around. In addition to the 6 years imprisonment, the pilot was fined $30,000 and barred from flying for 3 years. I certainly understand why the captain was subject to criminal prosecution, as his action seemed like extreme gross negligence. However, it may well be that you disagree. Please leave your comments below.